guys. Tonight we have a compilation of some of my favourite scary stories. Trying a different format here, we're going live. If you do enjoy it this way, let me know and I can maybe arrange to do it more often. But yeah, just let me know down in the comments below. Anyway, so without further ado, let's begin.
When I first saw him standing out there on the sidewalk, I thought nothing of it. I certainly didn't think he'd still be out there come September. I lingered at the window for just a moment, decided that the night-bound silhouette across the street was just some guy out for a walk, and went to my room and hit the hay. As I stood blearily over the coffee maker the next morning, my eyes strayed up to the window over the sink, and a little shock of adrenaline removed the need for caffeine. He was still there, and still standing on the opposite sidewalk looking at my house. My roommates had all gone to work long ago, so I waited for my coffee, got dressed, and then approached the front door and peered through the peephole. He was still there. I took a deep breath, readied myself for whatever nonsense this was going to entail, and opened the door. His gaze shifted to me as I stepped out onto the porch, and he watched me as I walked across the grass. He tensed when I stepped onto my sidewalk, but then looked relieved when I crossed it and reached the curb. Stopping there, I kept the pavement between us. I didn't know exactly how to ask him what the hell he was doing. "Hey, what's up?" He looked a bit nervous. "Nothing, just hanging out." From where I was standing, he didn't appear to be homeless or crazy. He was just a man of about 40 dressed in a dark blue robe, and I vaguely recognized him. "Don't you live in that house?" I pointed up to the driveway behind him. He nodded. "Yep, that's mine. Just came out to get the newspaper." I glanced down at his hand, where he held an orange bag with the newspaper rolled up inside it. "Well, looks like you got it." I paused. Another orange bag was lying further up the driveway, as if the one he was holding was actually yesterday's. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with a masked, nervous expression. "Did I see you out here last night too?" I asked. "Yep, that was me." I looked down further and saw that his feet were bare. "You weren't out here all night, were you?" I expected him to laugh off the idea, but instead he replied, "I was. You've been out here all night in bare feet." Panic was oozing out from under his mask of calm politeness in a dozen different ways. "Yes." Now I was starting to feel more than a little weird. "Are you going to stand out here all day too?" He strained to speak, but then seemed to change his reply. "I might. It's beautiful weather out." Well, that much was true. It was a warm summer's day, bright and beautiful. "Well, could you at least not stare at my house then?" He began to give an apologetic shrug, but stopped halfway through the motion and tried to turn. His bare feet never lifted from the sidewalk. The attempted turn was more of a twist from the thighs up. That, too, stopped rather quickly, and then he said, His gaze moved in a circle before he finally looked directly at me. "Your house is nice. I like looking at it." But then I was getting rather annoyed. "What's your name?" "Russ." "Russ? Well, it's nice to meet you." I shook my head. I'd never had to do this before. "If you don't stop being weird and staring at our house, I'm going to call the police." His eyes lit up. "Yes, please do that." That was a weird enough reaction that I actually got out my phone. I'd been raised to never involve the police for any reason, but this was abnormal enough that I felt I had to. I told the dispatcher we had a strange man standing outside our house and that he'd been there literally all night. Yes, all night. She said 2 officers would be with us shortly. Russ and I didn't talk much while waiting for them. He just stood there looking at me at random times, and around the neighborhood otherwise. Ours was a quiet street, populated by nice people who kept mostly to themselves. We never even had cause to really meet each other. If we had, I might have known more about Russ. But as things were, he was just some man acting strangely. Although his aura of massed nervousness calmed as a squad car turned down the lane and approached us. 2 uniformed officers climbed out and approached us with tired stances. One asked dismissively, "What seems to be the issue, gentlemen?" Russ looked to me hopefully. I told them, "This guy has been standing out here staring at our house all night long." The second cop rolled his eyes, but he did ask Russ, "Is that true, sir?" Russ gulped and stated, "Yes." Both cops straightened at the unexpected answer. The first one asked, "Seriously?" Russ nodded. The second cop looked at each of us for a moment and then said, "Well, move it along then." Russ tensed and stood a little taller. "No." "What?" I said, "No." As the pair began walking towards him, he added, "Sir." As one got out handcuffs, the other sneered and said, "Listen, asshole." But he stopped about 2 feet from Russ. His partner froze as well. "Come on," Russ urged them. "What are you waiting for? Come on!" The 2 men looked at each other with haunted expressions, then began to back away. The handcuffs were returned to their belt. "No," Russ shouted at them. "Do it, you pricks, you pigs, ugly bastards. Come on, beat me up. Teach me a lesson. Knock me down." The first cop's face was pale. "You're fine, sir. You're absolutely right. We're pigs. Just do what you like. Stand there as long as you want. You're on your property, technically, so this is none of our business." The second glanced at me with an apologetic terror. Both jumped in their car and peeled away. Russ screamed incoherently after them, but did not move from his spot on the sidewalk. I called the station a second time to ask what had happened, but after taking my address, the dispatcher told me never to call again and hung up. The anger faded out of Russ, and he saw me lower the phone. And I stood there, awkwardly, as the grown man across the street began to outright cry. I'd never seen a 40-year-old man blubber from sheer hopeless terror. "Russ, what's going on?" He couldn't answer past his tears. Looking left and right first, I finally stepped onto the street and got near him. I had the strangest notion, but I couldn't articulate it. The words simply wouldn't come to mind. An instinctual awareness was the most I could manage. I did reach the opposite curb right in front of him, and I was intent on pushing him back off his spot on the sidewalk, but I changed my mind about 2 feet away from him. It would have been weird to touch a crying, grown man. I stepped back to the street, confused. I tried a second time. At 2 feet away from him, literally within arm's reach, I changed my mind again. He could do what he liked. Who was I to interfere if he wanted to stand outside on a beautiful day? Each time I got close and then changed my mind, his tears and terror deepened. I remember murmuring, "All right, screw this," and backed up to the middle of the street to get space for a running start. I couldn't articulate what I was doing, but I guessed that a leaping tackle might work. I braced myself and then launched forward, ready to spring up at the proper distance. But as I went to jump at him, I changed my mind. There was nothing wrong, and I was being silly. Who cared about any of this? I slowed and curved away. His sobbing became a river. Despite an overwhelming sense that something was very wrong, I turned and went slowly back inside. I could still see him through the kitchen window, and I began going about the business of my day with a muted horror that I could not acknowledge gnawing at my heart. Each time I looked, I would hope against hope that he had moved, but he was always still there, shaking, crying, and looking around for help. That was June. A pall hung over our neighbourhood. Where once my roommates and I had held board game parties and half a dozen people over, now we ate meagre meals in silence. Whenever one of us would think to talk about something that had happened at work or perhaps an event we were looking forward to, we would get out half a sentence and then be overwhelmed by a sense of hollowness. Who could care about a concert or a trip to a water park at a time like this? We would stop our sentence midway through the glance out the kitchen window as a group. Always, Russ was standing there. He successfully avoided dangerous sunburns by lifting his robe over his head during the brightest hours, and he had a nearby tree to shade him at other times. His bare feet took the worst of it, and were red and boiled over a week. During that second week, we gathered daily as a neighbourhood. It was impossible not to have noticed him standing out there by then, and all the various residents of our street wandered out to speak to him and to one another with various polite topics which strained undertones. Terrible weather, a neighbour would say, her eyes fearful. The weather was gorgeous and beautiful. Absolutely terrible weather, another one of us would say. Horrifying, in fact. What the hell is happening with the weather? I remember the oldest of us, a woman who had lived through the Great Depression and was normally tough as nails, then cried openly and sobbed, "Why is the weather doing this?" Russ stood through all of this, visibly, hopefully, and terrified. The old woman screamed at him, "Why don't you just go inside?" He could only shrug and shakily tell her, "I don't want to go inside. I like sunburns on my feet." She approached with both hands up to throttle him, but changed her mind as she came within reach. "You're a man. You can take it. I shouldn't interrupt your enjoyment of nature." She hobbled away in tears, trembling violently. Another of our neighbours stepped forward. "At least take these clothes." He held a folded shirt and a pair of jeans forward, but turned away before getting close enough to hand them over. You probably don't want my old hand-me-downs." "Right," Russ replied hopelessly. "I'm fine, thanks though." It was the rainy season in our parts, and it began to drizzle on our heads, so we retired to our homes to gaze out the window and watch Russ thirstily hold open his mouth to the sky. Once the torrent was heavy enough, he could also lean down and scoop water from the flow running along the curb that gave us an idea. As a neighbourhood, we began to wash our cars more often. The runoff from the hoses would flow past Russ, allowing him to drink and stay alive, but only for as long as was normal for washing one's car. None of us mentioned it to one another, we just saw others doing it, so we did it too. The rainy season also brought worms up off the ground, which he ate, and he learned to stand still long enough for birds to come near. He would grab them and eat them whole. The sidewalk near him became foul with waste until each new rain washed it clean. One of the men on the street began building a long wood and metal contraption. For the first time in a month, we had something else to see outside our windows, and we watched him for nearly a week before getting a sense of what he was doing. It was a massively long Rube Goldberg machine full of levers, swinging hammers, rolling balls, and other assorted nonsense. From the 2x4s he'd laid out, he'd planned for it to extend all the way down the street, around the corner and out of sight. My roommates and I took a few days off work and wordlessly began helping. The older women in the neighbourhood brought out drinks and food for us. Russ looked on while we ate and drank, but he watched especially carefully while we worked. I'd never been one for tools, but I muddled through figuring out how to saw and nail things effectively, and the other men in the neighbourhood joined us without a word when they saw how serious we were. It took 6 days, but finally finished the contraption on the eve of a big storm. As the sky was growing dark, we gathered around the corner out of sight of Russ and stared at the button that would activate the machine. If all the levers and hammers and contraptions worked, Russ would be knocked over by a battering ram mechanism at the very end. We stared at the button. Our jogger approached and we stared at her. She slowed and looked worried that 30-odd people were watching her. We back up and glanced at the button repeatedly. "You want me to push this?" she asked, cautious but concerned. "Is this for some sort of prank video?" We looked at each other, and the old woman who had survived the Great Depression shrugged and nodded. The jogger moved close and hovered her hand over the button before backing up. "Nah, I'd rather not participate in a prank video." Her expression was fearful and pained. She jogged on as we stood in despair. The storm came and destroyed most of the mechanisms. The man who'd started it took it down in grief-stricken silence over the course of the next week. Russ watched the process with despondent eyes. A moving truck pulled up one morning and we gathered on the street to watch his wife begin packing things. "Russ lost his job because he stopped showing up," she explained, "and now we can't afford the place anymore." She looked over at him with narrowed eyes and said hatefully, "I don't understand why he's doing this, but I'm not staying with an unemployed loser who would rather stand around all day than do some honest work." "This is honest work," he called over, crying despite his words. "It's tough standing here without rest. I do get tired, but someone has to do it." We watched her put Russ's son in the passenger seat and then drive off with most of his contents in his house. We looked to Ross. He gulped, wiped his tears away, and gave the flimsiest reasoning I'd yet heard. "It's more important that I stand here than go after my family. I didn't value them anyway." He seemed to give up after that, letting the sun sear his flesh day after day and not even bothering to eat the worms that followed each storm. That was July. The first party our street had seen in months nearly sparked a riot. Our place was one of two on the street designed as off-campus housing, and the other house kicked off a kegger at about 7 o'clock one night. Outrage and anger flowed with us into the foyer of that house. The college guys therein turned down the music and had their friends hang back a second as the entire neighbourhood crowded in. The old woman asked, "What the hell do you think you are doing?" "Having a party," one of the guys responded. "What's the problem? We're not being loud." I was actually the one who spoke next. I remember my neighbour's anger vividly. "How can you have a party while things are the way they are?" One of the other guys who lived there protested. "So what? We are supposed to just stop everything and not live our lives because of the way things are?" The guest looked at us in confusion. The most painful part about the argument was that the guys were right. We couldn't just stop our lives because of what was happening on our street. The shouts and yells from each side were more about how we felt than any logical debate, and a fistfight broke out just long enough to knock over the keg and break 2 glasses. We held each other back and retreated as a neighbourhood, leaving the college guys to the party. I was bitter, so bitter, and we all felt the bitterness together, until another neighbour had a party 2 nights later. A week after that, one of my roommates had her friends over for a board game night, and I have to admit that it felt like such a relief to return to normality. At the end of the night, I walked the last of our friends out. I had one last joke and a laugh and then waved after them. Russ was just a silhouette in the darkness, always there but no longer on our minds all the time. Of course, the next morning the guilt hit me like a load of bricks as I stood over my coffee maker and studied the boil-covered red scarecrow across the street. His blue robes were growing tattered after months outside, and he looked like a burned corpse. Unfortunately, I had a stressful day ahead and I couldn't afford to process my guilt at the moment. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I was the one who did it. I closed the blinds over the kitchen window. I was supposed to have been just for the day, just so I could get through the big project at hand, but the blinds never came back up after that. As a house, as a group, we stopped looking out the window, just like washing our cars, just like working on the Rube Goldberg machine, and just like her reaction to the party, my neighbourhood took that as a cue. Within 5 days, all the blinds and all the windows on the entire street were lowered, the first night that Russ was completely alone outside in the dark. With all the blinds closed, an absolute guarantee that nobody was looking out for him or at him. I laid in my bed staring at the ceiling and crying quietly. This was not like the other pains on this street, not like the ones that couldn't be articulated. I knew exactly what I had done this time, and I could think and say the words since it was my issue and my guilt alone. I was the first one to close the blinds. I wanted to be the first to raise them again, to look out upon our neighbourhood problem and force everyone else to open their eyes and unite again. But I didn't have the courage. I needed to work. I needed to pay rent. I couldn't be the one, because raising my blinds would mean acknowledging the problem, and I couldn't afford to be racked by guilt and confusion and pain any longer. Each night I prayed that someone else would be the first to raise their blinds. Surely someone would do it. It was the only consensuous path, and someone would definitely feel compelled to do the right thing. Then we could all do it together. I'd put the issue out of my thoughts for so long that I was actually startled when I saw Russ healthier than before, with nobody mowing his lawn or trimming his trees, and with an abnormally rainy season. The greenery around him had grown to shade him near the entire day. His skin was back to a decent colour, where crinkled parchment had peeled off, and a large number of crickets and other bugs had taken up residence in his waist-high lawn. On these he fed, reaching down to grab insects at random and eat them when the urge struck him. I had looked because a car had pulled up, and I watched as a real estate lady got out and began pestering him. "Hey," I shouted from across the way, defensive over our issue. "You leave Russ alone." "This is ridiculous," she called back. "I need to sell this property and I'm never going to do that. And I'm never going to get a buyer interested in a property with a weathered homeless man standing outside of it." "He's not homeless," I shouted at her. "That's his home." "Not anymore. His wife got it in a divorce because he failed to show up to the hearings." I don't know why I said it. I meant the sidewalk. Somehow at some unknown point, I had accepted it as simply the way things were. The real estate lady glared at me and then at Russ, and then she got in her car and left. I knew what would happen next, and my roommates and I harassed the landscaping crew she sent until he got fed up and left too. If they moved the lawn and pruned the trees, Russ would be in serious trouble. We congratulated ourselves for a job well done and went back into our houses for board game night. That was August. The derisive talk began earlier this month. As the first chill of autumn hit the air, I think people instinctively knew that the worst was yet to come for him. Whenever we happened to glance his way, someone would spit and call him an idiot for standing there like that. "Why doesn't he just go inside?" someone would ask. "Yeah, what a dumbass," someone else would say. I just stared at them when they said these things. I did wish it would stop, that he would stop, but I don't know. I just don't know. I was prompted to write this and share our situation because I saw it in myself. I saw my feelings turning toward blame and hatred. I asked the same questions. Why was he doing this? Why wouldn't he just go inside? but the strange, dread notion that I could not articulate drove me to go outside and do something no one else had done in weeks. Talk to him. "Hey Russ," I said by way of opening, since I had no idea what else to say. His hair was mane and his beard was wild, but there was still a man under there. He coughed to clear his throat and then managed to say, "Hey, there was really no beating around the bush. You gave up for a little while there, didn't you?" He nodded weakly. "What changed your mind? Why are you eating and drinking again? Why do you fight so hard to survive?" I asked him, my heart full of compassion. I felt like I was such a great person for caring when nobody else did. I will never forget his bemused, angry laugh. He tilted his head and said, "To stick it to you assholes." That was the one answer I'd never expected. We had done so much for him, gone through so much guilt and angst and effort, but I guess I'd never thought about what it was like on the other side of the blinds. Standing there night after night, knowing the entire neighborhood was avoiding looking at you. I don't have an answer. I don't have any answers. I wanted to tell him good luck, but I would have just sounded hollow. I nodded and went inside. This time, I raised the blinds and stood by the kitchen window. As the first flakes of snow for the season began to fall, I accepted his angry gaze. Would the heat of his hate be enough to keep him warm through this winter? Summer seems impossibly far away, especially without so much as a blanket. And yet all the people who come over, all my friends and roommates and acquaintances, all just keep asking idly, why doesn't he just go inside? If only it were that simple. When they were little, my daughters loved power outages. If they were asleep when the power went out, my wife and I would wake them up and carry them into the basement. Tornadoes, though not common in southeast Michigan, were not unheard of during bad storms. The girls would giggle as they played games in the glow of a flashlight until they fell asleep in a heap of blankets. My wife and I were understandably not as thrilled about power outages, but both of us managed to find a silver lining in our daughter's joy. That silver lining faded after the largest blackout of the metro Detroit area in 5 decades. It was summertime of '95, during the worst storm I had ever seen. High winds threatened to tear out the trees lining the suburban street. Rain pounded against the windows like hundreds of tiny fists, and thunder shook the house like an earthquake. It wasn't a surprise when the power went out at 9:55 p.m. About an hour and a half after our daughters had gone to bed. My wife, who had been nervously watching the Weather Channel when the power went out, said, "Jim, we'd better get the girls to the basement." We trekked up the stairs to wake our daughters, who were predictably still awake and chittering excitedly in anticipation of a night playing with the flashlights. While my wife herded them to safety, I double-checked that all the windows were shut and locked tight, while checking the sliding glass door in the kitchen. Something in our backyard caught my eye though. I thought I saw a figure of a person lurking just by our back hedges. At second glance, the figure had disappeared, and I unsuccessfully tried to convince myself I was just unnerved by the storm. Feeling apprehensive, I went into my office to check the emergency corded phone I keep on hand for these power outages. I picked up the phone and my heart sunk when I didn't hear a dial tone. Who knows what was wrong with it? I hadn't even pulled it out in years. I went to the basement to check on my wife, who was engaged in a fruitless battle of trying to get my daughters to calm down and go to sleep. She shrugged at me. I'm just going to get the Barbies out for them. Good idea, I mumbled, and joined them on the floor watching my daughters dig through their bin of Barbies and worrying about not having a working phone. I was yanked from my trance by an out-of-place noise. My wife, daughters, and I all looked up as a muffled pounding broke the pattern of the wind and rainfall. I stood and jogged up the stairs, worried something had fallen onto our house. When I was at the top of the stairs, I heard a muffled yelling coming from the front room. I slowly crept toward the front door, my wife and kids a few feet behind me. Someone was pounding furiously on our front door and screaming. The high voice was neither distinguishable male or female, but it called, "Please let me in, please. I was in an accident and I'm hurt, please let me in." My wife went for the door handle, but I put my hand out. The hairs on the back of my neck were standing up straight, and every primal instinct in me was screaming to not let this person in our home. As soon as I looked at my wife, she understood. "Daddy," my oldest yelled, "aren't you going to help that woman?" My youngest started sobbing and buried her face into her sister. I stood there for what seemed like minutes, unsure of what to do, as the pounding and pleading grew more intense. "For the love of God, help me. I don't want to die in this storm." "Jim," my wife whispered, "what do we do? Should I call for help?" I shook my head and replied, "The phones aren't working. Even the corded one isn't." All of a sudden, the pleading voice changed its tone. The voice got deeper and screamed, "Open this fucking door!" The wooden door shook as if the person on the other side was throwing their body into it. My wife grabbed my daughter's hands and yanked him into the basement. I yanked out my pocket knife and stared dumbly at the door, unsure of what to do next. A few moments later, the pounding and screaming stopped. I took a deep breath and stared out and patrolled around the house. Looking out our windows, as I swept my flashlight over the living room window, my heart stopped. A man was pressed up against it. He was unhumanly skinny, gaunt, pale, sunken face and empty dark eyes, wearing a dark hoodie. We stared at each other for a minute in silence. Then he began screaming and rhythmically pounding both fists against the window with such force I was worried it would break. "I'll rip your guts out, I'll skin your little daughters and hang their bodies in your front yard." After a few minutes of his pounding and screaming, I stared helplessly as he ran off into the night. After he left, one thought crossed my mind over and over. There shouldn't have been any way for him to know about my daughters if tonight, during the storm, was the first time he had visited my house. For the rest of the night, my wife and kids were huddled in the basement, and I sat in a chair in front of the closed basement door with the largest kitchen knife I owned in my hand. As soon as the power returned in the late AM, I called 911. The police took almost 10 minutes to arrive, but they took statements and descriptions from my family and stationed a patrol car outside of our house. None of us got any sleep that night. At around 10 AM, I got up to make myself coffee and my family some pancakes. I flipped on the TV to watch the news, desperate for a distraction. The heading at the bottom of the screen read, "Breaking News." A pretty African-American news anchor stood in front of a suburban house, blocked off with police tape. New developments in the breaking story of the Metro Detroit family who was brutally murdered in their home during the citywide blackout last night. Warning: the contents of this story might be disturbing and graphic to some viewers. I stopped what I was doing, heart in my throat, and stared at the TV. Police say that a home intruder posing as a car accident victim entered this home around 1 AM this morning. After gaining access to the home, the intruder, described as a thin man, possibly in his 40s, held the family at gunpoint. He then shot the father of the family, 35-year-old Mark Howard, and tied up his wife Rachel Howard, 32, as well as their two daughters Emily, 6, and Becca, 4. Police say the suspect kept the family tied up for hours, subjecting them to violent torture before stabbing each at least 22 times. Miraculously, Rachel Howard survived her injuries and was able to get to a home phone after the intruder robbed the home and left. Sadly, Mark, Emily, and Becca were dead when the paramedics arrived. The suspect is still at large. A press conference from the Chief of Police with more details is scheduled to start at. There was more to this story, but I didn't need to hear it. That day, I bought a handgun and a new landline, guaranteed to work during power outages. After that night, my daughters didn't shriek with glee when the lights all went out.
So, where do I begin? I'm a pretty happy guy. I left state for college after high school, got a degree in psychology, and now work as a counsellor for high school aged kids. My little brother Mac is happily married with a 2-year-old son, which makes my mum turn her attention to me, heckling me about when I'll be able to give her more grandbabies. Life has been very good, but I've recently discovered something that may turn everything upside down. My dad needed help cleaning out the attic, something which he said hadn't been done since Reagan was in office. I agreed to help, but my brother wouldn't be joining us since he had to work. I had only been in the attic a handful of times throughout my entire childhood, so being up there again felt surreal. Dust and cobwebs coated every box, chair, and trinket in sight. I almost had 2 heart attacks thanks to a couple of rats scurrying around, but my father and I managed to sort through a lot of things, figuring out what was needed and what we could throw away. While my dad took a break, going down to the kitchen for a drink with my mum, I continued to curiously scour the attic. That was when something colourful caught my eye. It was one of my old comic books, lying unceremoniously on an end chair in the corner. I picked it up, waves of nostalgia surging through me as I admired the front cover.
which depicted my favourite superhero, the Hulk. He was raising a car over his head, his teeth clenched. It had to have been almost 15 years since I'd last seen that book. I was surprised at how good a condition it was in. The rats hadn't touched it. I flipped it open and began thumbing through the pages, enjoying a little piece of the past that had been forgotten. As I neared the middle of the book, however, a single sheet of white paper folded horizontally slipped out and drifted slowly to the floor, coming to a land at my feet. I kept a finger on the last page I had stopped on, so as not to lose my place, and bent down to pick up the paper. Opening it, I began to read the message that had been written. I can't take it anymore. I wish that someone could understand what I'm going through, but no one ever will. Mum, I love you so much and I hate to do this to you, but it's the only option that I have. Dad, you did your best for me and Mac, but still, I have to go. By the time you read this, I know that it will be done. Don't tell my friends the truth about what happened. Don't bury me either. I don't want to be worm food. Mac, you were the best brother in the world, and just know that it's not your fault. I'll be singing with the angels and watching over all of you from now on. Signed, Darby. I stared at the note for a long time after I finished reading. I read it again and again, not knowing whether or not this was a joke. If it was, then it was cruel, and I didn't think that anyone I knew was capable of doing such a thing. I stared harder at the words. My heartbeat hammered against my ribcage as I pondered the possibility of the note being legit. The handwriting was very similar to my own and written in orange ink, my favourite colour pen to use when I would write my journal or when I would write stories when I was younger. My head was spinning. Could it be possible that I had written this and simply suppressed the memory? I couldn't recall any negative experiences that could have made me consider killing myself. And I was sure that seeing something like this would bring such experiences to come back to me, but they didn't come. Darbs! I jumped, spinning around and hiding the note instinctively behind my back. My dad was standing near the entry to the attic, a confused look on his face. Everything okay? Yeah, Dad, I'm fine, thank you. Just, a little thirsty, I guess. I should have taken my break too. You mind grabbing me a glass of water? One glass of water coming right up, he replied. But as he descended the stairs, I could see him watching me closely. As soon as he was out of sight, I folded the note into a square and stuffed it in my pocket. I waited until I finished my water before telling my dad I needed to get some errands done, and that I would help him finish the attic another time. I went home immediately and tried comparing the handwriting in the note to my own. My current handwriting was a lot neater, but I could totally imagine myself as a teenager or preteen writing the way the message was written. Then again, if someone had been trying to copy my writing style, then that would explain the slight differences. After a couple of hours of questioning my childhood, I decided to sleep on it. Maybe I would call my brother and ask him if he remembered anything traumatic happening when we were younger. I lay in bed for hours, but just as I was about to drift off, I received a text from my mother. You found it, didn't you? I stared at my phone's screen, the only source of light in my pitch black bedroom. I was frozen in shock, not sure what to say or do. This wasn't right. It was well past 2 in the morning. My mother had never texted me this late before. I let the screen fade to black, and I was once again submerged in darkness. The creak of my fan spinning above me only put me on more on edge, and I remained lying in bed, completely numb. Surely she hadn't noticed that I had discovered this little piece of paper that had been hidden away in an old comic book for more than a decade. What the hell were the chances of that? Then again, my father had definitely noticed my discomfort and skittishness in the attic. I was even more anxious now. Maybe my mother was talking about something else. Maybe she was referring to the comic book itself, or something that she thought may have been of value to me or worth taking notice. That still didn't explain why she needed to text me about something so trivial at 2:30 in the morning. My phone buzzed again, the screen illuminating my face and making my hand jerk in surprise. My phone flew into the air and I leapt, catching it before it could land on the floor. I looked at the message. "You awake, hon?" "No, Mum, I'm not awake." I decided at that moment I would leave her on unread all night and reply in the morning. I knew how suspicious it would be if I responded at this time of night, even if I played dumb. A good night's rest was needed anyway for me to deal with the dilemma that was now at the forefront of my mind. I placed my phone on my nightstand and pulled my covers tightly around myself. I don't know when sleep came, but I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing once again very soon after. An immense torrent of dread poured down on me as I read the message. I didn't want to have to do this. No, this had gone way too far. This was my mother texting me, for crying out loud. It was time to man up and get to the bottom of this. I unlocked my screen and tapped Mum to call her. That was when I heard my mother's melodic ringtone down the stairs. She was in my house. I sat up in bed, terror engulfing me like it had never done so before. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps rushing quickly up the stairs along with the ringtone, which played like a swan song for my final moments. I had nothing to defend myself with. My dad had guns, but I had never wanted to touch one of the things before in my life. I tried to hop out of bed, maybe find a hiding spot, but in my haste in the dark I slipped, my phone flying through the air and landing on the other side of the room. My bedroom door burst open and I heard someone run in. What the f... I was hit in the mouth, and judging by the power behind the blow, I knew I was dealing with a man. I kicked out trying to knock him off his feet, but he came down on me, striking me twice in the face. I threw a punch of my own, blindly in the dark, and connected with what I was sure was the man's throat. The last thing I remember was hearing him cough before he knocked me out. I woke the next day feeling groggy as hell. My head was ringing and there was dry blood on my mouth. The sunlight streaming in through the curtains did nothing to remedy the situation. I sat up slowly, looking all around the room to see whether or not I was alone. It seemed that I was. The first thing that I needed to do was call the police. Looking across the room, however, I saw that my phone was gone. That made my head hurt even more. Glancing towards my nightstand, where I had stashed the suicide note, I saw that it was wide open. Now my head was surely going to burst open. Someone who had been carrying my mother's phone had actually come into my house, assaulted me, and stolen my phone and the suicide note. This was way too much. I knew I needed to record this somewhere. I needed to before I suffered any memory loss from the beating I had taken. I went down to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and walked around my house, just to be sure my assailant had left. Nothing was out of place or stolen, Whoever had come in the night had thrown a rock through one of my windows, but the hole was barely large enough to fit a person inside. This didn't make any sense. Why hadn't I heard it smashing? Then I noticed the back door. I was nearly 100% sure that I had locked it the day before. Now, however, it was unlocked. I knew I needed to get in contact with the police immediately. I went to my laptop and hurriedly recorded the series of events up to this point. Upon finishing up, I walked over to my neighbour's house. An iceberg held to my forehead, I used his phone to call the cops, and he let me sit on his porch as we waited for them to arrive. When they did, they asked me a series of questions about what exactly had happened. This was the most difficult part for me. I wasn't sure how the person who had taken my mother's phone had gotten into the house, whether they were sent by her or if it was even my dad I'd been fighting the night before. But I love my parents. I didn't want to drag them into this or incriminate them, yet. So I lied. I told the cops I had no clue who would want to steal my phone. I made no mention of the note. They dusted for fingerprints on my back door and let the medical team patch me up. Once I was cleared, the officers gave me a card with my case number and told me they'd keep a squad car in the area. I knew what I had to do next, even if I didn't want to. I drove to my parents' place and was surprised to see that there were a couple of cop cars sitting in their driveway as well. Fear stabbed at me like a cold knife as I darted out of my car and into the open front door. One of the cops standing near the stairs spun round and raised a gun. "Freeze!" "Put the damn gun down, that's my son," Father yelled angrily. And I could see him, my mother, my brother Mac, my nephew Elliot all on the kitchen table. There were 3 other officers there in addition to the one pointing the gun at me. He lowered it and looked at me sternly. "You don't run into a crime scene like that. That's how people get hurt." "A crime scene? Mum? Dad? Is everything okay?" Mum was still in her bathrobe. Elliot was looking down at a colourful book, flipping through pages, and Mac was shaking. "Someone broke in late last night," muttered my dad, his eyes piercing. Mac was helping me finish the attic, so Ellie spent the night here. Thank God that bastard didn't hurt my grandson. I'd never be able to forgive myself. "It's my fault, Dad," mumbled Mac, his voice hoarse. I went outside for a smoke and forgot to lock the back door. It was too easy for that asshole to come in here. "He stole our phones and the Blu-ray player from the living room," said my mum, staring down at the floor. "He must have been planning to take the TV too, because he came back. Mac was going to the bathroom and ran into the guy. He fought him, but the guy got away. He was very careful and methodical. None of us heard a thing until the altercation." I looked at my brother. He had cuts on both arms, and glancing over at the smashed glass that had been on the coffee table, I could see why. Mac's right fist was busted as well, swelling up badly. "Someone broke into my place too." They all glanced at me. Same thing, basically. Beat me up and took my phone. My mother and father looked at each other, then back at me. The police officer took a look at the card that the other officers had given me for my incident, took a few more notes, then left. Mac had refused medical attention. My mother hugged me as my father stood shaking his head. Mac held Elliot close, as though afraid someone might come back into the house. "Did you text me last night, Mum? Before your phone was stolen?" Her eyes narrowed as she looked at me. "No, honey, I didn't." We all sat in silence for a moment. "Hulk smash," giggled Elliot loudly. and that was when I noticed what book he was flipping through. It was my Incredible Hulk comic. I had reached my conclusion. At this point, it was very clear to me who had written the suicide note in the first place. Broken into my house, kicked my ass and left me bleeding on the floor. I pretended as though everything was okay as the day went on. I would steal furtive glances at my brother whenever he wasn't paying attention, wondering why he had written the notes in the first place. What could I have possibly done to him growing up? Sure, he was definitely more like Dad, a macho man who liked to play sports and go hunting. Dad was a retired construction worker. My brother had followed in his footsteps. I, however, had always been more like Mum, bookish, clever, and a people person. The reason I had gotten into psychology was due to the fact it was her line of study too. Despite our differences, however, my brother and I had never had any issues. At least I had thought so until recent developments. My brother's wife, Veronica, showed up later on in the day. My mum and Mac both decided to take naps, but my dad insisted on staying awake, sitting in his favourite chair with his pistol in his lap. "I'll give that asshole something to steal," he said as he stared through the window in the front yard. He lasted all of 5 minutes before he was stoning just as loud as Mac was upstairs. Veronica asked if I wanted to go to the park with she and Elliot, but I declined. Once she pulled out of the driveway, I knew that I had my chance. I grabbed Mac's keys from the counter and snuck out to his truck. Though he had tossed a jacket over them, I found quite the collection of things in a box. For starters, my mum's, Dad's, Mac's, and my own cell phone were all there. My house keys, which I figured had been easy for Mac to swipe from my parents, were also there. And there were 3 different books. I glanced towards the house just to be sure I was still alone, and then examined the books closely. One of them was falling apart and covered in dust, clearly from the attic. The title read, Le Livre de Contrôle de Hannerson, and looked to have been handwritten in French, though in later pages of the book, English had been scrawled. I didn't bother reading it. The other 2 books were the real bread and butter, because I recognised one of them. I hadn't seen the red cover in years. It was my journal, which I had stopped writing in when I was probably 15 or 16. The 3rd book was green with the name Mac scribbled sloppily on the front. I swiped both journals and all the cell phones. If I found answers, I would need to get the police as quickly as I could. I couldn't risk Mac waking up and leaving the house with the phones in his possession. I made my way to the backyard and hid my own and my mum's phone under a few rocks near the back door. These were the ones that were most important. In the event of something happening to me, I knew the cops would search the premises for clues. This evidence seemed to incriminate my mother, but I knew all it would take was fingerprint examination to discover that my brother had been the one at my house last night. I found a secluded spot behind a tree and flipped open my brother's journal. There was most typical things you would see a kid write about, but there were other strange things sprinkled in too. Grandpa says that I am not good enough to carry along the family legacy. He says I will never be more than a sheep. Darby is their favourite. I know it. Dad takes me hunting, but Darby is the one who brings home good grades and awards. Mum even says he is too smart. I don't remember doing my chores, but Darb says I did them. I think I have memory loss or cancer or something. I forget doing a lot of things. Maybe Dad will take me to the hospital. As Mac gets older, however, his journal entries begin to focus on regular things teenage boys would write about. I didn't find anything cruel or any sort of jealous words about myself in those pages. I then turned my attention to some orange-inked entries from my own journal. Dad took Mac out of school early to go and watch the baseball game. That's fine with me. Grandpa says I don't have time for sports. He says he will teach me the family way when I get old enough. Grandpa died in his sleep. I have been crying all night, but Dad says everything will be okay. I asked him if he will teach me the family way, but he doesn't know what I am talking about. Mum has been trying to teach me some weird words, but all I remember is sis nevere, pilmoy, and something detour. I'd much rather go into the science fair today. I think she knows that. Mum says I need to stop, but I'm better at this than her anyway. She can barely make Dad mow the lawn when he doesn't feel like it anymore. I can make Mac do whatever I tell him to. If he was smart, I would have him do all my extra credit work, but I know Miss Norris would fail me. Though she can resist it sometimes, I can make my mum do things too. Mac and Dad don't remember when they're under control. Mum does. I'm pretty sure Mum threatened me today. She says that unless I renounce my ways, or elegon mon spirit, then something bad will happen. I don't want her to hurt Dad or Mac, so I may go through with it. I'm not afraid for myself. I know that she cannot control me. That was the last entry in my journal. To my horror, I realized that I had managed to remember only the orange ink from the past. Nothing about any of this had ever been recollected in my mind. What the hell was really going on here? I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head. Stunned, I slumped over, and then my brother was on me again. Mac's eyes seemed void of emotion as he reared back his fist, hitting me several more times. Once I was dazed enough, he began binding my legs together with rope. In my daze, I could make out my mother standing slightly behind him, surveying me with cold eyes. I wanted to say something, but my mouth was numb again and my mind was slow. Once Mac tied my wrist behind my back, Mum muttered, "La maison," and he hauled me into the house by my collar. I was regaining my sense as he threw me hard onto the floor. He then stood back, crossing his arms, his swollen fist bleeding now. Mum, what the hell is going on?" I spat in anger. My mother had her arms crossed as well. Dad was still fast asleep in his chair, his gun slowly slipping out of his grip. "You forced me to do this, Darby. You've always had the family talent, I'll give you that. You probably didn't even need the damn book to invade the minds of weaker people. I thought my father and grandmother were adept at it, but you took it to greater levels. You even made teachers give you grades you didn't deserve. Though you were so smart, none of that was necessary. I was weary of you, but once you started dipping into my mind, well, that wouldn't do." "Dad," I yelled, and my father jerked awake, the pistol falling to the floor. He took one look at us both before he could even open his mouth. My mother shouted, "Sumil." My dad's eyes dimmed and he fell to the floor, apparently in a deep sleep. I turned back to this woman who I didn't recognize anymore. "So, what now, huh? You gonna kill him too?" She shook her head. "No, I can wipe his mind easily, but you, darling, well, you have reached the end of the line. I showed you mercy the first time, even after you wiped your own memories. I still considered having your brother kill you. Even if the police connected the dots and figured out that you didn't do it yourself, well, Mac would be the one to do time, not me. But I let you live. I let you prosper. I wanted you to give me grandchildren to train in the family art, but you didn't have the balls, apparently. I suppose Elliot will have to do. Maybe he has more willpower than his musclehead father. I was very aware of the pistol lying a few feet behind me. I only needed to stall a little longer. So, why am I alive right now? You could have had Max snap my neck in the yard. You hid the phones. I'm going to need those back, Darbs, and you're going to write a suicide note yourself this time. There are other ways I can make you do things. She turned towards the kitchen where my father's toolbox sat open on the counter. I took this opportunity to leap for the gun. I landed right next to it, but before I could even get a grip on it, Mac kicked me in the back and bent down, picking it up for himself. Well, that's just cost you an ear. I was going to have your brother start with your toes, but you just had to be Clint Eastwood, didn't you? I shouted the first words that came to my mind. Plis moi. My brother relaxed now, as did my mother. I stared in complete disbelief at them. Whereas my brother seemed to have lost the light in his eyes, there was not only recognition but rage in my mother's. I knew what I had to do. She was too dangerous to be left alive. Who knew what she would have my father, the judge, or any security guards do? I didn't know the words to say, so, tears running down my face, I spoke them in English. Mom, pick up the gun and shoot yourself in the head. There were tears streaming from her own eyes now, though whether they were from the sadness or anger I can never say. Once she did the deed, I told my brother to sleep, and he fell to the floor as well. Veronica found us just a few minutes later. I told the responding officers that my mum had hired someone to do her dirty work, but that when he had failed, she had decided to finish things herself. I claimed that I had talked her out of it, but she was so overcome with grief and guilt that she took her own life instead. We all cried, and I consoled them as best as I could. I knew they could never know. I took the journals and the family book and burned them in a wooded area. I don't know if any of my mother's extended family know about the book or have the gift, but I'm not worried about them coming after me. I'm better than them at this, after all.
I created this throw to tell you about what I see and hear. Feel free to ask any questions. I've been diagnosed with schizophrenia. I have symptoms, hallucinations. My brain scan MRIs don't show anything, and I generally puzzle my psychiatrist. I am not supposed to draw the dog anymore though. There is a dog. It started following me around the campus my freshman year at my university where I studied design, specifically fine art and illustration. I'd see it around the corners of buildings or from a distance. That first semester it just got closer. The first weeks I didn't think it was there, or couldn't really see it. But it got closer, it followed me. Now the dog isn't really there, my doctor says. No dogs are there. The dog's about the size of a small medium schnauzer. It's got black fur, and someone has skinned its face and head. The skin hangs in wet, gloppy, dangly strips around its neck. It can't blink, and I don't know how it eats without lips. It stares at me and other people with those bulging, exposed eyeballs and licks its twitchy, sinew snout. I'd feel bad for it if it weren't for the hands. The dog doesn't have paws, not a single paw. It just has 4 human hands for feet. Even if I can ignore it and not look at it, like my doctor says to do, I can still hear the slapping pat 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 noise of those hands as it trots along beside me through the tiled halls. I crawled up high onto my loft bed to escape it, but it paces. All night I hear the pat 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 of those hands.
Sometimes it looks at me with those terrible eyes, and I swear to God it looks like it wants to talk. At night I'd move its mouth when it looked down from my loft, like talking. But the dog has never made a sound, except for the pat 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 of its hands. It doesn't cry like an injured dog would. It doesn't bark. I still think it has something to say. I don't know why it follows me. Nobody else sees or hears it. So maybe it just has something to say to me. But in those cold, dark, lonely moments when I'm alone with it and it's moving its silent, mutilated mouth, I feel a great fear. I do not want to know what it has to say to me. I really wish it would go away. My psychiatrist said we're going to do a different medication since the Seroquel doesn't keep the dog away. I just hope the new meds don't open its voice. Number 2. Growing up, I had one younger sister named Karen. Karen had some special qualities, as my mother liked to call them. We knew the day she was born she was different. It was short of a miracle she was born, honestly. My mum was 45 and had developed ovarian cysts that prevented her from getting pregnant again. The doctors still have trouble explaining how it happened. Most of them call it an act of God. But Karen wasn't heavenly. I was 7 when she was born. The age gap put somewhat of a wedge in our relationship. I was used to being spoiled as an only child. Now I had to share the spotlight with my miracle of a sister. I'm not ashamed to say I had somewhat of a resentment towards my baby sister. I got in trouble often for my behaviour towards her. I wouldn't let her play with my toys. She couldn't use my markers. I'd trip her in the hallway. My mother always said she worshipped me and I needed to be kinder towards her. She's a blessing from God. You need to treat her like one, my mother would say as she stroked Karen's head. Karen would sneer at me with vengeance. As most children do, I got over my resentment of my sister when I entered 7th grade. I was 13 and she was 6, and was pretty cute. She was quieter than she was when she was a toddler, and cleaned up after herself. She was polite at the dinner table, asked before she used my things, would offer me the last popsicle. I didn't mind Karen as much, and we would watch movies together on Friday afternoons when my parents were at work. The first day it happened. It was the middle of the summer going into my 7th year. My parents had to work summers, and since I had just turned 14, I got to stay home and watch Karen unsupervised. It was a really hot afternoon, and we were on the back porch. Karen was in my mum's garden, up to her ankles in mud. She was pickling through the dirt, calling out the bugs she was finding. She was pretty smart for 7. She really enjoyed nature and animals, primarily bugs. I was on my phone talking to the boy I liked at the time, not really paying attention to Karen. She called out, "Black Widow!" I leaped to my feet and sprinted to the garden. "Karen, put that down. Don't let it bite you. They're bad bugs," I tried to say calmly but firmly. Karen's demeanour changed. She looked at me with narrowed eyes, the spider still in her palm. "Spiders don't hurt me, Margaret," she said in a voice way too deep for a 7-year-old. I don't know if Karen even knew my full name. It made me take a step back in shock. "Karen, are you okay?" I asked, moving forward to approach her. She took her grubby little 7-year-old hand and smashed the spider into her palm. I heard the spider shriek briefly and the crunching of its back. I squealed in shock. She brushed her hand off and stepped back into the muddy garden. I ran inside to find the phone number for my mum's work. I dialed her number as quickly as my shaking hands would let me. Are you kidding me right now, Margaret? I don't want to hear your horror stories, my mother groaned when I finished telling her what Karen did. It's not a story, Mum. I'm scared the spider bit her. They're poisonous. What if she's hurt? I was still shaking. I turned and Karen was peacefully wadding in the mud, pulling out bugs to examine. Well, go look, she sighed. I could hear papers ruffling in the background. I prayed she was coming. I went back outside and approached Karen. Karen, did the spider poke you? I asked, getting to my knees. Spiders can't hurt me, Margaret, she said, in the same deep voice from before. I stumbled back. Did you fucking hear that? I whispered. I had never cursed in front of my mum, but I was so scared. She took in a little bit of breath. Did she call you Margaret? She whispered. Yes, I croaked out. I'm coming. Keep watching her. She's hung up swiftly and I moved back to the chair under the umbrella I had previously inhabited. Karen continued digging through the mud, pulling out bugs and announcing what she found to no one in particular. She called out Black Widow again, but I was too afraid to move to her. She looked across the yard at me with narrowed eyes. Watch this, Mamie, she called. She crushed the spider in her hands and popped in her mouth and began to chew. I immediately vomited. She giggled, an innocent laugh, and skipped across the yard. She did somersaults and cartwheels until my mother arrived. I met her at the sliding door and informed her of what she did. My mother looked as white as a sheet. She was much braver than I was and crossed the yard in 3 strides. She scooped my sister up and immediately ushered her out to the garage. She strapped Karen into her booster seat and agreed to let me sit in the front. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. Karen was humming a song I had never heard before. We reached the hospital and my mum rushed us in, holding Karen close to her chest. My daughter was bit by a black widow. I need to see someone now, she hissed in the front window. To my absolute shock, a nurse quickly ran out and took us into a room. When I broke my arm in 3rd grade, I didn't see a nurse for 2 hours. I huffed in resentment and followed my mother and sister as we waved through the hospital. Karen was looking at me with anger. I had told on her. When we reached the hospital room, my mother tried to set Karen on the bed. Karen let out the loudest wail I had ever heard. I clapped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut. Karen wouldn't stop screaming until she was lifted from the bed. My mother held her and paced around the room until the doctor arrived. He was a short man with round glasses that made his eyes bulge. When he got close to Karen, she would wail and swing her arms around. It took 3 nurses to hold her down while she did blood work. He told my mum she was probably having a reaction to the spider venom. My mother wept until my father arrived. Karen was finally laying on the bed after some mild sedatives the nurse had given her. She was sucking her thumb, something she had never done. She was still glaring at me with a warning in her eyes. The doctor came back and asked to speak with my parents outside. I, of course, pushed my ear against the crack of the door to eavesdrop. We couldn't find any neurotoxins, which is the venom in your daughter's blood. If she ate the spider, it would be there, and a lot of it. Are you sure she actually ingested it? He said in a hushed and worried tone. It was my other daughter who saw her eat the spider, but she crushed another in her hands. I saw the carcass, she said. I could tell she was going to be upset with me. I rushed back to my chair and the door opened. My father poked his head in and gestured me to come out. I exited the room with my head hung. So, you saw your sister ingest the spider? The doctor asked me. I nodded. My mother for some reason didn't look as if she didn't believe me. See, She ate the spider, my mother said, grabbing my shoulder. She wouldn't lie. I was somewhat shocked by this. The doctor nodded and went back into the hospital room to speak with Karen. We followed but kept our distance. Your big sister tells me you had quite the snack today, he said, rolling a chair next to her bed. She glared at me with such force my mum even took a step back. Margaret is a liar. Spiders would never hurt me, she spat in a dark voice. I thought my mother was going to faint. The doctor looked puzzled. Your sister Margaret said you ate a spider. Did you eat a spider, Karen? He said with a little more force. She rolled her tiny eyes. Of course I did. It was in my garden after all, she said, sitting up. Why would you eat a spider, Karen? You like bugs, right? He said, still trying to be friendly. I do, she said, sounding like herself. She started listing off all her favourite bugs in a childlike admiration. So if you like spiders so much, what made you decide to eat one, knowing how bad those spiders are, he asked. Because, you fucking idiot. Spiders can't hurt me, she spat at him in a dark, twisted voice. It sounded almost like there were two voices speaking at once. The doctor looked shocked and disgusted. He stood up swiftly and looked at my parents. I suggest you take her to a mental facility. There's something wrong with your daughter. He left the room quickly. My mother was crying again, but my father didn't try to console her. He was already on his phone and leaving the room. I was terrified of her. There was something wrong with her. Karen moved her legs to the end of the bed. The best way I can describe her next movements is that she spilled out of the bed. She sunk to the floor and if she was made of rubber and crawled with her stomach facing the air. I screamed and ran out of the hospital room and down the hall, as far away as I could get. Karen never came home. The next day, a young woman in a dress made of suede came to her house and collected Karen's things, her toys, colouring books, favourite stuffed animal, everything that was hers. It stayed in my room, occasionally peeking out to watch them haul Karen's things away. To say I was relieved was an understatement. For the next year, we visited Karen in a facility for mentally disturbed children called Charles Home. She wore a white hospital-type gown with her hair cut short. We would visit, she wouldn't look at us. She would only colour. When my mother would ask what she was colouring, she would show us a picture of spiders eating me. The resentment I had towards my sister when I was younger was nothing compared to hers for me now. I eventually stopped going to visit. I turned 17 when Karen came back to live with us. She was 10, but a childlike imagination she had when she was 7. She was 10 but had the childlike imagination she had when she was 7. I was still afraid of her. I couldn't get the image of her crawling across the floor out of my mind. I sat at the kitchen table completely emotionless when she entered the house. She was extremely pale with her hair that reached just below her ears. She entered the kitchen and smiled at me. Hi, May, she said almost hesitantly. I smiled at her. Hi, Karen. I'm happy you're home. I lied. I wasn't happy. I was terrified. She rounded the table and approached me with open arms. I stood and gave her a weak hug. I avoided her as much as I could. My mother homeschooled her, so she spent all of her time in the house. She liked to sit at the kitchen table and draw pictures of her family. They were always positive. We would be sitting at the beach or at the park or on the couch. We'd all be smiling, holding hands, saying we loved each other. Every time I saw them, I could only think of the one she used to draw of me being eaten by giant spiders. My mother informed me of what was wrong with Karen a few weeks after she arrived home. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and multiple personality disorder. Sometimes she would turn into a new person. You could see it in her eyes, hear it in her voice. She had 4 personalities, one of them being the dark voice that haunted me often. One of them was a spider, like a legitimate spider. She wasn't supposed to talk about her personalities with anyone but her therapist, but they told us what they could about them. The dark voice name was Paul. Paul was from the dark place, as Karen called it. Paul liked to put her in danger and trick her into doing bad things. It was Paul who ate the spider and cursed at the doctor, not Karen. Her therapist told us. Paul is not a danger to you, only to Karen. I hardly believed it, but we had to. We had to treat Paul like he was just another child only. Paul was my older demon brother who had arrived to stir up trouble. He was like a bad case of herpes. When I referred to Paul as the herpes demon, my mother just about murdered me. Her spider personality was absolutely unexplainable. Her therapist thought it came as a pair with Paul, since Paul liked to stir up trouble and spiders were troublesome. Paul would summon this personality. When Karen was a spider, it was horrifying. She would click and squirm around the room, crawling with her arms and legs sprawled out. It was so terrifying. Her other 2 personalities were relatively harmless. One was named Rebecca, who was a nursing student from New York that liked to correct me when I would bring up topics from my schoolwork. The other was named Damien, who was 3 and just played with toy trains. Damien was my favourite personality because he didn't know any real words, just train and mama. I continued to avoid Karen for as long as I could. I wouldn't speak to her. I'd hardly look at her. My mother turned the guest room into mine so I could be as far away from her as possible. As much as it broke my mother's heart to see me so disinterested with my sister, I would hide away. She understood though. At least I think she did. Karen kept to herself as I did myself. I would only talk to her to ask to pass the salt. On my 18th birthday, things took a turn for the worst. I was ready to move out with my boyfriend, Aidan. Aidan hardly came to the house because I was so ashamed of Karen. Since her return, she was so awkward, uncomfortable to talk to. She spoke in a soft, drawl-like voice that made my skin crawl. She took 5 different medications, while her episodes were mostly under control. She would have violent spasms every so often. These were worse than any kind of episode. Her spasms almost always came in the form of a spider. She would scramble across the floor, her mouth clicking and foaming. She chased me into a room one night when I had snuck in past curfew. It was my best friend's birthday and I wasn't allowed to attend her party because I had SATs the next day. I snuck out my bedroom window and tried to slip in at 2 AM without a sound. I locked my door in fear of Karen coming in, so I was able to sneak out a lot. But when I came home that night, my makeshift ladder and bed sheets had disappeared. I huffed and rounded the house for the front door. I searched for the spare key, trying to make a little as noise as possible, and slipped into the house. I thought I was home free, but I heard soft clicking coming from the couch. I knew it was Karen. I tried to tiptoe past the couch and end up the stairs. She leaped from behind the couch with inhumane force. I screamed in fear, wet myself, and sprinted up the stairs. She was moving so quickly and erratically I thought for a second I really was being chased by a spider. My mum was standing in her doorway, angrily tapping her toe, but was quickly in tears as I sped past her to my bedroom with Karen at my feet. "Karen, wake up, come back," she screamed after her. I slammed my door on Karen's prying fingers and listened as she scratched and moaned at it. I heard my mother screaming and crying. I was so petrified. I snuck out my window and stayed at Aidan's for 2 days before I returned home. My mother greeted me at the door with a look of solace. a nurse was sitting on the couch with Karen, drawing blood and taking her temperature. Karen has the flu. Maggie says that why she had such an episode, she whispered, guiding me with some force to the couch. Karen looked up at me with severe bags under her eyes and vomit-filled bucket in her lap. "I'm so sorry, May," she whimpered for the first time in ages. I saw my real sister looking back at me. I nodded softly. "It's okay, Karen," I said. I meant it somewhere deep down. She cried again and turned away. 2 weeks later, I turned 18 and announced I was moving in with Aidan. He was 20 and already had his own place. I was so mortified of staying in this house, I was ready to move in with 3 boys to get away. At dinner the night after my birthday, I told everyone. My mother, of course, was devastated, but again understood. My father was unfazed as he had been since Karen's return and simply said he'd get me boxes from his work. Karen, however, slammed her fist down on the plate, completely shattering it, sending shards everywhere, including into her hands. The dark, haunting voice that stared in my dreams came bellowing out of her throat. "Moving, Margaret," she, or he rather, screamed. "You're fucking leaving me with these imbeciles? You mean to tell me you're planning on fucking your tool of a boyfriend every night while I waste away here?" My mother flinched as Paul took over dinner. We were taught not to respond to Paul. My mother jumped from the table and ran to the kitchen for the first aid kit. I looked down at my lap as Paul stood up in the chair, cursing at me. "You want to go be a whore, do you, Margaret? Well, fine. But you'll be fucking sorry," he shouted. I glanced up, only in time to see him holding a shard of broken plate up to his throat of my host of a sister. I screamed in horror. "Paul, stop, don't hurt her!" I screamed, launching myself across the table. The shard went into my shoulder as I tackled Karen to the ground. Paul was shrieking obscenities at me as we wrestled. I had never replied to Paul, but he took pleasure in the fact I shouted his name. "Accept it. I'm better than her. Karen is a weak little bitch. She always has been," he screamed in my ear. I somehow got on top of my sister and pulled her hands behind back to keep him from being hurt. Within 15 minutes, the police and the doctors from Shals arrived to take her away. For the next 15 years, she spent her days wasting away in her prison of a hospital. I visited her once as she stabbed me with a shiv made from her toothbrush. I married, had a child, and moved far away from Shals and my family. At Shals they never met Karen again. The only personality Karen exhibited was Paul. He had completely taken control of her. If her name was ever spoke, Paul would writhe in fury and find a way to hurt himself. My mother called me. My mother called me often to tell me about Karen. She claimed she could see Karen behind Paul's eyes, that she was in there begging for help. When Karen turned 18, my mother begged Charles to release her into her care. Of course, they legally had to, and Karen went back to my mother's house to live with her. My father left my mother when I was 20. He said she was obsessed with Paul, which she was. She convinced herself for the first 2 years of Karen's second hospitalization that Paul was her son and that Karen was never truly there. She of course changed her mind later that claimed she could see Karen in Paul's eyes. After a few months of Paul living with my mother, he snuck into her room and choked her nearly to death. He was arrested for aggravated assault and was put into a psychiatric ward for the remainder of his sentence. When his sentence was up, the hospital deemed he was still a danger to society, and unbeknownst to me, Paul agreed to stay in the hospital. Until today, I would tell people I was an only child. I didn't speak about Karen and the demons that embodied her. In fact, I had forgotten about Karen. She was a distant memory that I left behind in a therapist's office. but I speak of her today because last week, her 27th birthday. In America, turning 27 means you're no longer on your parents' insurance. 27 means the hospital has to release you into someone's care until you can apply for insurance yourself or have the means to pay for yourself. My mother is 72 and can't afford the hospital fees for Karen. So last week, Karen went home to live with my mother. She called me in tears of joy. "My baby girl is coming home, May. She's coming back," she cried into the phone. I called her crazy and ignored the calls she placed to me over the next few days. I ignored them until 2 nights ago. 2 nights ago, at 1:30 a.m, my mother called me 10 times in a row. On the 10th call, I answered rather angrily. "Sue, what the fuck could you possibly want at this fucking hour?" I spat into the speaker. A soft, drawling laugh came from the other end and made my heart stop. Aidan woke up and turned on the bedside lamp. "Margaret, didn't our mother teach us not to swear?" Paul's voice was like honey, dripping from the ceiling, and I was bound to the chair, unable to escape. I wet myself for the first time in 15 years. Aidan jumped up from the bed and rounded to me. "What is it? Is it your mum?" he asked, kneeling beside me. "Where's Mum, Paul?" I whispered, even though I knew the answer. "You stupid fucking girl, always being stupid. Probably all that sex you had, a little whorish teenager," he laughed. He always knew how to hit me where it hurt after all this time. "Where is she?" I insisted. "She's where she should have been years ago, when she sent me away to that god-forsaken place. That stupid tramp deserved it," he spat at me. I could hear him walking over broken glass. "Karen, I know you're there," I whimpered, pleading, crying. "Don't fucking speak that name," Paul wailed, making me pull the phone back from my ear. Karen was a weak bitch. That's why I made sure she never returned. "Karen, please, don't let Mum suffer," I pleaded again. Aidan was somewhere off calling the police. All I could hear was the static and the sound of Paul's wails. "Stop saying her name," Paul screamed. I heard crashing and more glass breaking, then a small yelp I hadn't heard since I was 13. There was silence, then breathing, then crying. "Mamie, I killed her," came a soft childlike voice from the other end of the phone. "Karen," I squeaked. I could hear her softly crying. "He did it, May. I have to tell," she whispered again. Aidan came in the room and showed me his phone, which was lit up with a call placed to 911. "Karen, stay with me," I pleaded. I had somehow gotten myself up to the bed and put on a robe. I followed Aidan to the car in the garage, leaving my daughter Gabby asleep in her bed. My mother's house was a 15-minute drive away. She moved closer to me when Karen was released. I could hear Karen crying and moving around the house. "He did it, May. Please believe me," she cried. She was 27, but still sounded like a 7-year-old. "I believe you. Go outside," I begged. She was quiet. "Don't let them blame me," she whispered, as if someone was coming. "Karen, please." I started, but she was swiftly cut off by a screaming laugh from Paul. "Stupid bitch talks too much," he grunted, and then gunshot rang out. I screamed, causing Aidan to jolt off the road. When we finally arrived at my mother's, the police were already there, scrambling to cover up the bodies Paul left behind. My sister was sprawled in the grass, her eyes open and full of glassy tears. I hadn't seen her since I was 22, and she stabbed me in the stomach. She looked lost, as if she had been looking for something when she slipped away. My mother had been suffocated. The police said she didn't struggle, as if she allowed him to take her. Paul had written in my mother's blood, "You're next, Margaret," on her bedroom wall. The police found in the bedroom a wall covered with pictures of me, both young and recent. They suspected he had been stalking me, finding right time to attack. The hospital called this morning to ask me to come in. They had found in the wall of Karen's hospital bedroom a secret stash of drawings and journals she had kept. Most of them contained plots against the people of the hospital, our family, myself. But there was a stack of drawings that she had done on the off chance Karen came out. All of them were her and I holding hands on the beach, saying, "I love you." I used to have a sister named Karen. I wish I could have saved her. You would probably be surprised at the number of bodies one can find out in the desert. You would probably be even more surprised at how often people play with the bodies. But I don't know, since most of us are tweakers or disadvantaged youth doomed to repeat the mistakes of our alcoholic mothers and abusive fathers. Maybe you wouldn't be surprised at all. My best friend, Cameron, found last winter's corpse du jour. An old man in a dilapidated trailer, a white beard matted with corpse juice hung past his bony knees. So Cameron bought him a Santa hat from the Dollar Tree and christened him Satan Claus. Satan Claus was a popular attraction among the high desert's underbelly until Gidget Gagnon blabbed to her brother, who was a deputy sheriff. This pissed Cameron off. He didn't grow up here, so he didn't understand the rules. There's always a snitch. There's always a whiner. There's always a freak. And there's always someone who fantasizes about killing you. Even if he understood, he'd never have believed that I was both the freak and the person who fantasized about killing him. I'd known Cameron since we were teenage patients at a country psychiatric facility. It was the first time in our lives either of us had ever had security or structure. I miss it, honestly. We moved in together the second we could. For the record, we weren't lovers. We never even experimented. I couldn't separate sex from trauma, and didn't particularly want to try, so I was voluntarily celibate. This enhanced Cameron because he has a Madonna whore complex the size of Babylon. I was his pure, unsullied princess. This is why he paid half my bills, supported me emotionally, and asked for nothing in return. That's not to say he didn't have sex. Cameron was a bona fide man whore. That's the only reason he went to raves and parties. The girls. We were at just such a party the night I met Daddy. The party was in a bashed up warehouse that smelled like roadkill and alcohol. Cameron stayed glued to my side for a while. I guess to make sure no one else swooped in to fuck his Madonna off her pedestal. But it didn't last. It never does. A girl I recognized vaguely, waist-length black hair, and makeup you could scrape off with a putty knife, was eyeing him ostentatiously. I thought it was disrespectful. To the untrained eye, Cameron and I were a couple after all. Now, Cameron was drunk by this point. He gets handsy when he's drunk, even with me. So I cuddled up and wrapped myself around him. He was enjoying it. Cuddling doesn't break the Madonna pedestal, it just makes him feel special. But I messed up. We were sitting in the corner, starting to play around. He was looking at me in a way no one else ever does. Bright and warm and hopeful. Like I'm the most important person in the world. I could feel myself teetering on the edge of the pedestal. Then he leaned in to kiss me. I panicked. Before I knew it, I was running. I pretended I was flying, that I'd dash outside and leap into the air, taking flight among the mad whirl of constellations. I could almost see it, the warehouse shrinking as I gained altitude, the night winds cooling the sick heat inside me. For a mad moment, felt the feathers sprouting from my skin, itchy and hard and growing fast. I made it outside and halted. No feathers, no flight, no night wind scraping the brokenness away. By the time Cameron had found me, the night's chills had settled into my bones and I was shivering. Only when he tapped my shoulder did I realize I'd been crying. I wiped my eyes hastily and turned. The black-haired girl lingered several feet away. She had a small smile, halfway between anxious and satisfied. "Hey," Cameron slurred slightly. "Demetria and I are leaving. Will you get home okay?" "Her name's not Demetria," I said in as bored a tone as I could muster. "It's Brittany." All at once he looked a lot less drunk. You know her name doesn't matter, don't you?" We stared at one another for what felt like a terrible, long minute. He was waiting for something, and I knew it. But I couldn't give it. Even if I could, I'd stop mattering the second he got it. "Don't keep her waiting, Cameron." His face somehow drew upward, then fell into a flat smile. He gave me a half-assed wave and left with Demetria. I counted to 1,000, then went back inside. A humid rush of sweat, piss, and beer bubbles crashed over me like a wave. The crowd writhed and squirmed like maggots. Music blared. Bargain bin lights spun over everything. It all seemed so pointless. Nothing would be accomplished here tonight. Nothing would ever be accomplished here on any night. I looked down at the floor. Amid the chewing gum, spilled drinks, gouges and stains, I saw 3 words written in black Sharpie. "Come to Daddy." An arrow underneath pointed east. I looked up at the pointless party and thought of Cameron, of the way he looked at me. He'd be giving that look to Demetria just now. So I followed the arrow. Halfway across the warehouse was another message and another arrow. "Keep coming." I followed it to the black wall to another Sharpie message. "Hurry, Daddy's waiting for you." This arrow was absurdly long and pointed to a bland door I wouldn't have noticed otherwise. I opened the door. Cold, foul air swept over me. I gulped a deep breath. It was preferable to the sweat-heavy humidity behind me. Before me was a set of rickety metal stairs. I descended and found myself rewarded with another message. "Daddy's coming through the back." I turned into a low concrete corridor, lit by flickering fluorescent lights. Something came into view at the other end, bony huddled and terribly small. A body. Its head lay tilted against the wall, open jaw yawing up at the ceiling. Overhead, painted in streaky letters, was a single word. "Daddy." An oil drum sat next to Daddy. I withdrew, gagging, when I saw the half-rotten sludge of dead vermin at the bottom. A nightstand sat on his other side, bearing a plastic container filled with Hershey Kisses. A hand-lettered sign read, give Daddy a kiss. This crazy bullshit was enough to salvage the night. Smirking slightly, I unwrapped a kiss and popped it into Daddy's gaping mouth. A second later, he shuddered and began to chew. His head lolled weakly with a heavy grunt. He flopped forward so that his eye sockets were training on me. Something glinted within. Dark and iridescent like dirty oil. He swallowed the kiss and spoke. What do you want from me? Terror and mirth whirled together in a mad tornado. What? He lurched forward, desiccated body hitting the concrete with a clatter. I can give you one thing. Any one thing. What shall it be? I thought about it. I really did. If wish-granting, harshly loving corpse exists, might as well take advantage of the wish. Except I didn't know what to wish for. I didn't want to be normal. People like Dimitri are normal. I didn't want another life. Why bother when I barely want to live? I couldn't have Cameron. He'd have to turn into something he's not before that would even be possible. I didn't want money. I didn't want a house. I didn't want a better job. All of these are changes at some point. Every change causes pain. I've had enough pain for a lifetime. I don't know, I said. Daddy's dark eyes flared. That does complicate things, he smiled. Papery skin cracked and split like porcelain varnish. But it makes them interesting. Give me a rat, he pointed to the vermin barrel. I need protein. It didn't occur to me to resist. This was the first time in memory that I actually felt alive. I snatched a mushy tail from the morass. Only half a rat emerged, melting into translucent rot before my eyes. I tossed it to Daddy, who lunged like a spaniel and caught it in his mouth. He swallowed it whole, then said, I can tell you the deepest desire of your heart and give it to you. Why? Because I can. This was the only justification I recognized, the only one I believed, the only one that made sense. Then do it. Not that simple. I need energy. More rats, I asked. Well, of a kind, he chuckled, but not exactly. He watched me expectantly. Those sockets glinted madly, reflecting every colour under the sun and several I couldn't describe. Music thumped from upstairs, loosing trickles of dust and reverberating through Daddy's lair. I don't get it. People. I need people. Or rather, parts of people. Skin, eyes, hair, livers. I eyed him suspiciously, wondering just how fast this monkey's paw motherfucker could run. You could get all of these for me. You're my client. Clients pay the provider's price. You pay the provider's price in bodies. I need 2 eyes, 2 lungs, and 1 stomach, 1 liver, and 1 skin. He continued rattling off seeming every organ in a human body. Then he finished. And each must come from a different person. I contemplated this briefly. You'll show me what I want. Something I added silently that will make me happy. And you'll give it to me? I swear on my name. Which is? He wagged a finger. Sorry, darling, names are power here. But an oath upon my name, spoken or otherwise, is unbreakable. I watched him. He smiled widely. The thin remains of his mummified skin split and flaked off like snow. Under the lights, he looked like a cross between a Halloween decoration and a bad Photoshop project. Except for his eyes, those dark, writhing masses of nearly hidden colour. I turned around and went back up to the party. Almost immediately, I spied a long, shimmering curtain of black hair across the floor. For a triumphant moment, I thought it was Demetria. But no, she resembled Demetria though, and that was enough for me. She wandered around nervously, a tragically overgrown little girl lost. I pretended I was her ride home and let her downstairs. Daddy warped and shuddered and grew into something that blotted the lights, something I couldn't look at without panicking, and swallowed her whole. I kept my eyes closed until Daddy cleared his throat. He'd grown skin, thick and fleshy, lipless. It reminded me of absurdly a squashable upholstered sofa. Dull, cracked teeth glinted in a recessed mouth. Will I have more tonight? I got Daddy a stomach, 2 eyes and a liver before the night was done. I chose dirty, dusty men, the kind that looked as if they'd been sucked dry, homeless tweakers, people who, for all intents and purposes, have already disappeared. I know how sick it is, but please try to understand. The only thing I ever feel are fear and panic, and it only happens when someone touches me unexpectedly. Can you imagine what it's like to be dull and empty like a reptile, except when you accidentally triggered into reliving the worst moments of your awful life? I'd have given anything to change that. Anything to have something that would make me happy. So I fed Daddy people that no one would miss. It's easy to find them if you know what to look for. Men with sucked-in faces who ride children's bicycles. Women with nice bodies and ancient, haunted faces. Dust-caked teenagers and old men sleeping under tarps in the desert. It took a month. In that month, Cameron began to date Demetria. She spent more time in my apartment than I did. After I walked in on her blowing him after a long shift, I went to my room and started packing. I don't have much, so it didn't take long. Cameron caught me as I dropped the last bag in the trunk. His eyes were wet. "She doesn't mean anything," he said. I slammed the trunk shut. "Then that makes you a shitbag, Cameron. Tell me to dump her, I'll do it," he said. "I'm not your mummy." He ran his hands through his hair. His lips started to tremble. Loathing exploded through me. "You're the most important person in my life. Only because I can't be." I climbed into my car and drove off. After a couple of brutally cold nights under the stars, I moved into the warehouse with Daddy. He sang lullabies and fed me Hershey kisses from the dark, dirty plastic bowl. No matter how many I ate, the bowl never emptied. Daddy didn't expect conversation, affection, or any attention at all. All said and done, it was a relief. I still went to work, of course. Cameron came every night. I felt a cruel surge of triumph whenever he wandered in. He still looked at me as he always had, like I was the only person that mattered. Then Demetria followed him in. The fight was a truly spectacular example of a white trash beatdown. He and Demetria were banned, and I got written up. I didn't really bother though. That night, I found a raggedy fat man in foul-smelling clothes out behind the restaurant. I told him he could stay at my house if he had wanted. He was slow, childlike, and took me at my word. Daddy ate him quickly and spit the bones into the rat barrel. Then he burped. Enormous fleshy cheeks beating like sails in the wind, and sat down. "We're almost done," he said. "Only one body left." I did a quick calculation. 2. A heart and a brain. He chuckled indulgently. "I've had a brain all this time. All I need is a heart." By this time, Daddy looked like a cross between Nosferatu, Frankenstein's monster, and a Picasso painting. Pale, fleshy, and muscular, with ridiculous Fabio hair and a thick and decently red mouth that didn't quite fit his skin. He had one green eye and one brown eye. In place of whites, that murky, oily rainbow continued to swirl. "I'll find it tonight," I told him. He hesitated theatrically. "There's a special rule for the heart." My skin tightened. "I need your heart." My pulse beat slow and heavy in my throat. "That's against the rules." He laughed. "You misunderstand. I don't need this," he tapped my chest. "Tired little muscle, I need your heart. Only it's inside someone else." "What?" I asked. "What are you talking about?" "A heart that is yours is a heart that loves you." "You mean Cameron?" He smiled and nodded. "I almost left. But why? Cameron didn't really love me. He loved his illusion, his pure little princess, someone he couldn't touch, someone who was too good to be touched." It was a paradox. The moment he got what he wanted would be the moment he lost it. But he could help me get what I wanted. If he really loved me, that would make him happy, wouldn't it? I drove to my old apartment and knocked. Cameron answered the door, smelling like dirty clothes and whiskey. His eyes went wide when he saw me, then he started to cry. "She's gone," he said. "I'm so sorry." "You've got nothing to be sorry for." I came inside and held him. He got handsy, but I let him. Maybe because I was expecting it this time, or maybe because there was finally a light at the end of the tunnel. It was okay. It wasn't enjoyable. My heart raced and I felt sick as he was too intoxicated to do a whole lot. But he was gentle and careful. He had got what he wanted, before he could realise that he'd knocked his angel off her pedestal. Before he could take my heart away, I talked him into a drive. The drive to the warehouse was the happiest I'd ever seen him. I led him through the warehouse, pausing every minute or two for a hug or a kiss. That was fine. It was good to make him happy. Only when he saw Daddy, hulking and grinning under the fluorescent lights, did Cameron realise that something was wrong. Daddy stood up. He looked awful. 9 feet tall and completely wrong. A hybrid of every childhood nightmare. "Get back," Cameron told me. Daddy charged Cameron, shoved me towards the stairs. I felt his hand on my back, felt his pulse beating through his wrist for a fraction of a second. Then Daddy grew, blotting the lights, bones cracking and creaking as he exploded into something I couldn't quite comprehend. And then, like all the others before him, Cameron was gone. My heart began to pound. From grief or excitement. I couldn't tell. "We're done," I said. "So where is it?" "Where is what?" Daddy stretched luxuriously. "What I want." I could feel my blood pressure rising. "The thing I want." "You mean the deepest desire of your heart?" "Yes." He grinned and dropped to his hunches, posing like a runner about to take off. "Here it is." He took a deep breath. The stillness was excruciating. Poised overhead like a crushing weight, then Daddy opened his mouth and threw up. Bloody and foul, full of shattered bones and flesh, it flooded towards me like a tide, and floating within it, a pale crown jewel, was Cameron's head. Daddy gurked up a final outpouring of viscera and settled back. There it is. My skin pricked and stung. I thought of fears, small and hard and piercing the skin as they forced their way up. I turned and ran. I did not fly through the air, but I flew across the sand. Stars lit my way, a million eyes glazing the desert in silvery darkness. Sometimes around dawn, just as gold and red bloomed across the horizon, I tripped and fell. I remember watching the sunrise. Then everything went dark. Cameron found me. When we got home, he helped me into the shower. I sat blankly as dust and dried blood skirted down the drain. After 20 minutes, he helped me out and put me to bed. I fell asleep quickly. I woke around mid-afternoon. Sun streamed through the window. Cameron slept beside me. His shirt was hiked up halfway over his back, revealing what looked like a tattoo. I lifted his shirt, half expecting to see Dimitri's embellished name, and froze. Not a name. Not even a tattoo. Just 7 words written in black Sharpie. Give Daddy a little more credit, honey. Thank you all for listening.